Sometimes the desert holds secrets that change a man's life forever. In the Arizona territory of 1876, wandering cowhand Luke Mercer thought he'd seen everything the harsh frontier could offer until he stumbled upon something that would test every belief he held about loyalty and justice. A lone mustang stood guard over an ornate chest buried in the sand, refusing to leave despite the scorching heat. When Luke finally opened that chest, what he found inside wasn't gold or silver, it was something far more dangerous. The sealed journal of a missing U.S. Marshal and a map that would put a target on his back. Now outlaws, Pinkerton agents, and a mysterious woman are all hunting him across the unforgiving desert. But why did that horse refuse to abandon its post, and what secret was it protecting? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The August sun bore down on the Arizona desert like the wrath of an angry god, painting the endless expanse of sand and rock in shades of copper and gold. Luke Mercer pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the relentless glare as he guided his mare, Rosie, along what passed for a trail in this god-forsaken stretch of territory. At 34, Luke had spent half his life drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town, never finding a place that felt like home. His father had been a circuit preacher who died when Luke was 16, leaving behind nothing but worn-out boots and a Bible with more miles on it than most horses. His mother had passed the year before, taken by consumption in a drafty cabin outside Tucson. Since then, Luke had made his living with his hands and his horse, working cattle drives, breaking broncos, and doing whatever honest work presented itself. He was good with animals, had a gentle way about him that even the most stubborn mustang seemed to respect. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like a sentinel against the blazing sky. This was harsh country that tested a man's character, where weakness meant death and strength was measured not in how many fights you won, but in how many you avoided. Luke had learned to read the signs, the way buzzards circled, how a horse's ears twitched at sounds human ears couldn't catch, the subtle differences in the color of sand that might mean water or quicksand. He'd been riding since dawn, making his way toward Prescott, where he'd heard there was work on a ranch that needed experienced hands. His water was running low, and Rosie was showing signs of fatigue despite her steady temperament. They'd need to find shade soon, maybe hole up during the worst heat of the day and continue when evening brought some relief. That's when he saw it, a flash of movement against the monotonous landscape. At first, he thought it might be a mirage, one of those cruel tricks the desert played on travelers. But as he urged Rosie closer, the image solidified into something real and puzzling. A mustang, dark brown with white markings, stood motionless beside what appeared to be a mound of disturbed earth. The horse's head was lowered, its posture suggesting both vigilance and exhaustion. Luke dismounted carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones as he approached. "Easy there, boy." "Easy now." The mustang lifted its head, fixing Luke with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow and determination. The animal was magnificent, clearly wild, but well-formed, with the kind of spirit that marked the truly free horses of the territory. As Luke drew closer, he could see what had captured the mustang's attention. Partially buried in the sand was an ornate wooden chest, its brass fittings tarnished, but still visible. The desert wind had carved patterns around it, creating small dunes that suggested it had been there for some time. Yet the mustang's presence indicated this was no abandoned relic stumbled upon by chance. "What are you guarding there, friend?" Luke asked softly, extending his hand palm up for the horse to smell. The mustang snorted but didn't shy away, allowing Luke to step closer to the buried chest. It was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of dark wood with iron reinforcements. Someone had taken great care in its construction, and whoever had buried it here had chosen the location deliberately. Luke glanced around, checking for any signs of human presence. The desert appeared empty, but he'd learned never to trust appearances in this country. Apache could move like ghosts when they wanted to, and there were plenty of white men who'd learned similar skills for less honorable purposes. The Mustang seemed calm, though, and horses were better judges of danger than most men. Kneeling beside the chest, Luke began carefully brushing away the sand. The Mustang watched intently, occasionally stamping a hoof, but making no move to interfere. As more of the chest became visible, Luke could see it had been deliberately concealed, not simply lost to the shifting sands. Someone had dug a proper hole and covered it, leaving only the smallest portion exposed. The lock was solid but weathered, and Luke's experience with ranch equipment had taught him something about metalwork. Using his knife and a small file from his saddlebags, he worked at the mechanism until he heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The Mustang's ears pricked forward as if it too recognized the significance of the sound. Luke hesitated before opening the chest. In his 34 years, he'd learned that some discoveries changed a man's life in ways he never intended. But curiosity was stronger than caution, and the Mustang's unwavering vigil suggested this was something that demanded attention. The lid opened with a creak of hinges that hadn't moved in months. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items that made Luke's breath catch in his throat. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact. A folded map drawn on what appeared to be official territorial surveyor's paper. And nestled beneath both, something that made his hands tremble, a U.S. Marshal's badge, tarnished silver with the distinctive star that carried the full weight of federal authority. Luke lifted the badge carefully, feeling its surprising weight. Engraved on the back were the words, Jacob Whitmore, Arizona Territory, 1875. The name meant nothing to him, but the significance was clear. This wasn't some cowboy's keepsake or a child's toy. This was the badge of a man sworn to uphold justice in a land where justice was often scarce. The journal fell open in his hands to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was steady and clear, the words of a man accustomed to making reports. Day 47 of pursuit. The Joaquin brothers have the gold, but they're not the real problem. Someone in the territorial government is feeding them information, someone with access to federal communications. I'm close to the truth, but if something happens to me, let this record stand as testimony. The gold belongs to the people of Arizona, not to corrupt men who would steal their future. Luke read the passage twice, feeling the desert heat differently now. This wasn't just treasure, it was evidence of conspiracy and corruption. The Mustang moved closer, as if sensing Luke's growing understanding of what they'd uncovered together. The map showed a detailed route through the Superstition Mountains, marked with landmarks and distances in the same careful handwriting. X marks indicated cache points and safe houses, while notes in the margins warned of known outlaw haunts and territorial patrol schedules. This was the work of a professional lawman, someone who understood both the country and the dangers it contained. Luke folded the map carefully and closed the journal, his mind racing with implications. Marshal Jacob Whitmore had disappeared somewhere in this desert, leaving behind evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of territorial authority. The Mustang, this had been Whitmore's horse, hadn't it? Still standing guard over his master's final mission, waiting for someone worthy to take up the cause. You've been waiting for the right man to find this, haven't you, boy? Luke said, reaching out to stroke the Mustang's neck. The horse allowed the touch, and Luke felt something pass between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a transfer of responsibility. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Luke knew he should make camp soon, but the journal's words had kindled something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, direction, the sense that his life might finally mean something beyond the next day's wages. He gathered the items carefully, wrapping them back in the oiled cloth before closing the chest. The Mustang watched as Luke tied the chest to his saddle. then fell into step beside Rosie, as if they'd been traveling companions for years. Three unlikely partners, now a drifting cowhand, a worn-out ranch mare, and a mustang with the heart of a guardian angel. As they made their way toward the mountains where Marshal Whitmore's map would lead them, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The desert had eyes, and word traveled fast in country where water was scarce and strangers were memorable. By opening that chest, he'd stepped into a world where trust was deadly and justice wore many faces. But the badge in his saddlebags seemed to pulse with its own weight of authority, and the mustang beside him carried himself with the dignity of a horse that had served the law. Whatever lay ahead, Luke Mercer was no longer just another drifter seeking work. He was the inheritor of Jacob Whitmore's unfinished business, whether he'd asked for the responsibility or not. That evening, Luke made camp in a shallow canyon where ancient waters had carved smooth walls from red sandstone. The mustang, whom Luke had taken to calling Sentinel, grazed peacefully beside Rosie, though his ears remained alert to every sound. As twilight painted the desert purple, Luke opened Marshal Whitmore's journal by the light of a small fire. The entries began 6 months earlier, written in the measured prose of a man accustomed to documenting facts. Whitmore had been investigating reports of Confederate gold that had disappeared during a transport through Arizona territory in the final months of the war. What should have been a routine recovery had become something far more complex and dangerous. The gold was never meant for Richmond, Whitmore had written. Intelligence reports suggest it was payment for a weapons shipment from Mexican sources, destined for Apache bands willing to continue fighting Union forces after the war's end. When the transport was attacked, everyone assumed it was random banditry. They were wrong. Luke turned pages carefully, following the Marshal's investigation through meetings with territorial officials, interviews with witnesses, and the gradual realization that the theft had been orchestrated from within the government itself. Names appeared repeatedly: Territorial Secretary Edmund Carstairs, Indian Agent William Morrison, and others Luke didn't recognize but whose positions suggested significant influence. Morrison visited the Apache again today. Read one entry. His interpreter confirms they've received no weapons, which means the gold bought something else entirely. I suspect we're looking at a conspiracy to establish private mining claims through fraudulent territorial surveys. The gold would fund such an operation, and the profits would be substantial. The fire crackled as Luke absorbed the implications. This wasn't just about missing Confederate treasure, it was about the systematic theft of Arizona's future, orchestrated by men sworn to protect its citizens. No wonder Whitmore had disappeared. He'd uncovered something that threatened powerful people's fortunes. Sentinel suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the canyon mouth. Luke immediately doused the fire and moved to his rifle, but the mustang's posture suggested curiosity rather than alarm. Moments later, Luke heard what had caught the horse's attention, the soft whisper of approaching hoofbeats. "Hello, the camp," called a woman's voice, clear and steady in the desert air. "I'm not armed, and I'm coming in." Luke kept his rifle ready but didn't aim it as a figure emerged from the darkness. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair braided down her back and clothing that marked her as someone comfortable in rough country. What struck him most were her eyes, brown like sentinels, but holding depths of pain that spoke of recent loss. "That's my horse," she said simply, nodding toward Sentinel. "Ma'am?" Luke kept his voice neutral, but his grip on the rifle remained firm. "The mustang, his name is Sentinel, and he belonged to my fiancée." She stepped closer to the horses, and Sentinel whinnied softly in recognition. Marshal Jacob Whitmore. Luke felt the world shift around him, like sand in a windstorm. "You're Elena Vasquez. Jake wrote about you in his letters." "No, not you specifically. But he said if something happened to him, he hoped an honest man would find what he left behind." She gestured toward Luke's saddlebags, where the chest was secured. "I see Sentinel led you to it." The mustang moved to Elena's side, nuzzling her shoulder with obvious affection. She stroked his neck, and Luke could see tears glistening in her eyes despite her composed voice. Jake trained him to guard important things, documents, evidence, anything that needed protecting. When Jake didn't come back from his last patrol, I knew Sentinel would stay with whatever Jake considered most important. The badge, the journal, Luke began. Evidence of a conspiracy that goes all the way to Washington, Elena finished. Jake was close to exposing it when they killed him. They! Elena's face hardened. Indian Agent Morrison and his associates. They've been using their positions to steal territorial resources, falsify land claims, and eliminate anyone who threatens their operation. Jake discovered that the Confederate gold was just seed money for something much larger. Luke studied her face in the starlight, reading the truth in her expression. How do you know all this? Because I was working with him. I'm not just some rancher's daughter, Mr. Mercer. I work for the Territorial Governor's Office, assigned to investigate corruption in the Territorial Administration. Jake and I were partners in more ways than one. She pulled a folded paper from her jacket, an official document bearing the territorial seal. Elena Vasquez, Special Investigator, reporting directly to Governor Safford. Jake's investigation was part of a larger effort to clean up the territory before statehood. Luke lowered his rifle, the pieces falling into place. So, when Whitmore disappeared, I've been tracking the investigation ever since, trying to piece together what he learned, but the evidence went missing with him, and without it, we can't move against Morrison and his associates. They're too well connected, too careful. Sentinel moved between them, as if approving of their conversation. Elena smiled sadly at the horse. He's been searching for Jake's cache for 3 months. I've been following him, hoping he'd lead me to whatever Jake hid before they caught up with him. The map, Luke said, understanding dawning. It shows locations throughout the territory. Cache points where Jake hid copies of documents, evidence, witness statements. Everything we need to bring down the corruption network if we can reach them before Morrison's people do. Luke felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Why are you telling me this? You could just take the chest and continue on your own. Elena's laugh held no humor. Because Jake's journal mentions that the conspiracy includes Pinkerton agents on Morrison's payroll. They've been tracking territorial communications, intercepting reports, eliminating problems. I can't trust official channels anymore. She gestured toward the map spread between them. Besides, look at these locations. Some are in Apache territory, others are in outlaw country. Jake knew this land better than anyone, but even he needed local knowledge to navigate safely. I'm good with a gun, and I know the political situation, but you know horses and country. Sentinel trusts you, which means Jake would have trusted you. As if to emphasize her point, Sentinel moved to Luke's side and bumped his shoulder gently. The Mustang's message was clear. Elena spoke the truth, and they needed to work together. Luke looked at the blood-stained map in his hands, noting how the stains seemed concentrated around one particular location, marked with Jake's distinctive X. The Marshal's final cache, perhaps, or the spot where he'd made his last stand. Either way, it represented a trail of justice that demanded following. There's something else, Elena said quietly. Morrison knows about you. Luke's blood chilled. How? Jake wrote about finding an honest cowhand in his final report, transmitted before he disappeared. Morrison intercepts territorial communications, remember? He doesn't know your name yet, but he knows someone found Jake's cache. That's why I've been pushing hard to reach you first. How long do we have? Elena checked the stars, calculating time and distance with practiced ease. Morrison's men are maybe 2 days behind me. The Joaquin brothers outlaws who work for Morrison, they're coming from the east. We need to move at dawn if we want to stay ahead of them. Luke folded the map carefully, his decision made. Then we'd better get some rest. Tomorrow we start following your fiancé's trail. Elena nodded, then surprised him by reaching into her saddlebags and producing a small silver locket. She opened it to reveal a photograph, a stern-faced man in a marshal's uniform standing beside Sentinel. That's Jake. He was a good man who believed justice was worth dying for. She closed the locket and met Luke's eyes. I hope you're the kind of man worth his sacrifice, Mr. Mercer, because once we start down this trail, there's no turning back. Morrison's people don't leave witnesses. Sentinel whinnied softly, and Luke placed his hand on the mustang's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the warm hide. Marshal Jacob Whitmore had died, protecting the truth about territorial corruption, leaving behind evidence that could restore honest government to Arizona. Now that responsibility had passed to Luke, whether he'd sought it or not. "We'll follow the trail," Luke said quietly. "All the way to the end." Elena smiled for the first time since appearing at his camp. "Then we'd better hope Jake's map is accurate. Because tomorrow we ride into country where honest men are scarce and justice comes at the end of a gun." The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying scents of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, enemies were closing in, drawn by the scent of secrets that threatened their corrupt empire. But Luke had never backed down from a fight when right was on his side, and he wasn't about to start now. Besides, he had Sentinel to guide them, Elena to watch his back, and Marshal Whitmore's badge growing heavier in his saddlebags with each passing hour. Justice might be scarce in Arizona territory, but it wasn't extinct, not as long as honest people were willing to stand up and fight for it. Dawn came too soon, painted in shades of rose and gold across the desert sky. Luke woke to find Sentinel already alert, ears pricked toward distant sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Elena was awake too, efficiently breaking camp with the practiced movements of someone accustomed to traveling light and fast. "Riders coming from the south," she said without looking up from securing her bedroll. "Sentinel's been restless for the past hour." Luke checked his rifle and mounted Rosie, noting how Sentinel positioned himself between Elena's horse and the canyon mouth. The mustang's protective instincts were sharp as razor wire, honed by months of guarding his master's secrets in hostile country. They rode hard through the morning, following Jake's map toward the first cache point, marked in the Dragoon Mountains. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, red rock giving way to pine-covered slopes that offered both concealment and danger. This was Apache country, where Cochise had once led his warriors against Mexican and American forces with equal ferocity. "Tell me about Morrison," Luke said as they paused to water the horses at a hidden spring Jake had marked on his map. Elena's face darkened. "William Morrison came to Arizona territory 5 years ago as Indian agent, supposedly to help negotiate peace with the Apache bands. What he actually did was use his position to identify valuable mineral deposits on tribal lands, then arrange for those lands to be purchased at fraction of their worth." She pulled the silver locket from her jacket, opening it to reveal not just Jake's photograph, but a smaller picture tucked behind it, a man in an expensive suit standing beside a fancy carriage. "That's Morrison. He lives better than most territorial officials, which should tell you something about his income sources." Luke studied the photograph, memorizing the features of a man who'd ordered Jake's death. Morrison appeared to be in his 40s, well-fed and confident, with the kind of eyes that calculated profit in every situation. How did Jake get onto him? Apache complaints about treaty violations, miners showing up on reservation land with legal documents that shouldn't have existed. Jake started investigating and discovered a pattern. Every major mineral find in the territory had been legally transferred to Morrison's associates before the discoveries were announced. Elena's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd seen justice perverted by greed. The Confederate gold was supposed to fund expansion of the operation into New Mexico territory. Jake interrupted that plan. "And now Morrison knows we have the evidence to expose him, which is why we need to reach Jake's cache points before his people intercept us. Each location contains documents that prove different aspects of the conspiracy. Together, they build a case that even corrupt territorial courts can't ignore." They mounted again and continued climbing, following game trails that Jake had marked as safe passage routes. Sentinels seemed to know the country, leading them around deadfalls and rock slides that could have trapped unwary travelers. The Mustang's memory of riding this country with Jake was proving invaluable. Near midday, they reached the first cache point, a natural cave hidden behind a screen of manzanita bushes. Elena checked her copy of Jake's map, while Luke examined the entrance for signs of disturbance. "Someone's been here," he said, noting broken branches and disturbed earth around the cave mouth. "Recently." Elena drew her pistol, and Luke noticed she handled it with professional competence. Jake said each cache was marked with a specific sign, something only he and I would recognize. They approached carefully, finding the cave mouth wider than it appeared from outside. Jake's mark was there, a small cairn of stones, arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to casual observers, but clearly had significance to Elena. "It's undisturbed," she said with relief. Jake was careful about false trails. Inside the cave, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden behind a natural rock formation, they found Jake's first cache. Documents detailing Morrison's land transactions, correspondence with mining companies, and sworn statements from Apache leaders about treaty violations. Evidence that would destroy careers and send men to prison. "This is good," Elena said, scanning the papers. "But it's not enough. Morrison's lawyers will claim the Apache statements are unreliable and the land documents appear legal on their surface. We need the financial records Jake was tracking." Luke was studying a hand-drawn map included with the documents, a detailed survey of mineral deposits throughout the territory, marked with dates and ownership transfers. "Your fiancé was thorough. He was the best investigator the Territorial Marshal Service ever had. That's why Morrison had to kill him rather than simply transfer him away from the investigation." Elena's voice carried pride mixed with grief, and Luke found himself respecting the depth of her commitment to Jake's memory. This wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about honoring a good man's sacrifice. They secured the documents in Luke's saddlebags and prepared to leave, but Sentinel's sudden alertness stopped them cold. The Mustang's ears were pointed down the mountain, his posture rigid with warning. "Company," Elena whispered, moving to the cave mouth. Luke joined her, peering through the screen of brush toward the trail they'd followed up the mountain. 3 riders were making their way steadily upward, moving with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. "Joaquin brothers," Elena identified grimly. "The tall one is Carlos, the leader. The other 2 are his cousins, Miguel and Roberto. They're Morrison's private army when he needs work done outside official channels." Luke studied the approaching riders, noting their weapons and the quality of their horses. These weren't desperate men driven by hunger. They were professionals, well-equipped and dangerous. "How did they find us so quickly?" Jake suspected Morrison had Apache scouts on his payroll, men who could track anyone through country like this. Elena checked her ammunition, counting rounds with practiced efficiency. "We can't outrun them with tired horses, and they know this country as well as we do." Sentinel moved restlessly, clearly wanting to warn them of the approaching danger, but trained to remain silent when stealth was important. The Mustang's intelligence continued to impress Luke. Jake had trained a remarkable partner. "The cave has a back entrance," Luke observed, noting how air currented through the space. "If we move now, we might be able to circle around and get to the horses before they reach this position." Elena nodded, but her expression remained grim. "Even if we escape, they'll keep tracking us. Morrison's people don't give up. Then we need to reach the next cache before they do." Luke gathered their gear quickly, noting how Elena moved with the same professional efficiency she'd shown in everything else. Whatever training the territorial governor's office had given her, it hadn't been limited to paperwork. They slipped through the cave's rear entrance, finding themselves on a narrow ledge that overlooked a steep ravine. The drop was dangerous, but not impossible, and pine trees growing from the rock face offered handholds for a careful descent. "Jake mentioned this route in his notes," Elena whispered. "He called it the back door to heaven because it led to safety if you were brave enough to use it." Luke went first, testing each handhold and foothold before trusting his weight to it. Elena followed with sure movements that spoke of previous climbing experience, while Sentinel waited patiently above, somehow understanding that he needed to remain hidden until they could retrieve him. The descent took 20 minutes that felt like hours, but they reached the bottom without alerting the Joaquin brothers to their presence. Now came the dangerous part, circling back to reach their horses without being seen. Luke led the way through thick pine forest, using every trick his father had taught him about moving quietly through rough country. Elena matched his stealth, and Luke found himself increasingly impressed by her capabilities. She was far more than just a territorial investigator. She was a skilled operative, trained for exactly this kind of work. They reached their horses just as the Joaquin brothers discovered the cave entrance. Carlos was shouting orders in Spanish, directing his cousins to search for sign while he examined Jake's carefully placed markers. "Now," Luke whispered, and they mounted quickly. Sentinel appeared as if by magic, having found his own route down from the cave. The mustang's mountain training with Jake was evident in how smoothly he navigated terrain that would challenge most horses. Within minutes, they were riding hard down a hidden trail that Jake's map showed, leading to safer country. Behind them, angry shouts indicated that the Joaquin brothers had discovered their escape, but Elena's smile suggested they'd gained precious time. Jake always said the best way to win a fight was to avoid having it in the first place. "Smart man," Luke agreed, checking their back trail for signs of pursuit. "The smartest. That's why his evidence will bring down Morrison's entire operation, if we can stay alive long enough to deliver it." They rode toward the next cache point, knowing that each mile covered brought them closer to justice and deeper into danger. Morrison's people would be converging from all directions now, desperate to stop the evidence from reaching honest authorities. But Luke felt Sentinel's steady presence beside him, Elena's determined courage matching his own, and the weight of Jake's badge in his saddlebags reminding him that some fights were worth the risk. Marshal Jacob Whitmore's investigation would be completed, no matter what it cost. The second cache point lay in broken country, where ancient volcanic activity had left a maze of canyons and hidden valleys. Luke consulted Jake's map frequently as they navigated the treacherous terrain, noting how the Marshal had marked safe passages and dangerous areas with military precision. "Your fiancé was thorough," Luke commented, studying notations about water sources and emergency shelters. Jake spent 2 years mapping this territory before he started his investigation, Elena replied. "He said you couldn't fight corruption effectively unless you knew the ground better than your enemies." They were following a narrow canyon when Sentinel suddenly froze, ears pricked forward. Luke immediately reined in Rosie, hand moving to his rifle. The Mustang's warning had saved their lives at the cave. He wasn't about to ignore it now. "What is it, boy?" Elena whispered, scanning the canyon walls for movement. The answer came in the form of a distant metallic click, the sound of a rifle being cocked. Luke spotted the glint of sunlight on metal among the rocks above, then another and another. They were surrounded. "Riders below," called a voice from the canyon rim. "You're trespassing on private land." Luke recognized the accent-cultured Eastern, the kind of voice that belonged in territorial government offices rather than desert ambushes. "We're just passing through," he called back. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You have something that belongs to the United States government, and we're here to retrieve it." Elena's face went pale. "Pinkerton agents! Morrison's brought in federal muscle." A man appeared on the canyon rim, well-dressed, despite the harsh environment, holding a rifle with professional competence. Luke estimated at least 4 others positioned around the canyon walls. They'd walked into a carefully planned trap. "I'm Agent Patterson, Pinkerton National Detective Agency," the man announced. "You're interfering with a federal investigation into stolen government property. Surrender the documents you took from the cave, and we'll escort you safely back to Tucson for questioning." Luke felt anger rising in his chest. "What stolen property? We found materials belonging to a missing U.S. Marshal. Marshal Whitmore was suspected of corruption before his disappearance. Patterson replied smoothly. The documents you discovered are evidence in our investigation of his activities. Turn them over, and no charges will be filed against you. Elena's voice cut through the canyon air like a blade. That's a lie, and you know it. Jake was investigating Morrison, not working for him. Miss Vasquez, isn't it? We've been looking for you as well. The Territorial Governor's Office has concerns about your recent activities. Luke realized they were facing something worse than simple outlawry. They were up against the corruption of legitimate authority. Patterson and his men could claim legal justification for whatever they did, making resistance appear criminal rather than heroic. Sentinel pawed the ground restlessly, and Luke noticed the Mustang's gaze was fixed on a particular section of canyon wall. Following the horse's line of sight, Luke spotted something Patterson's men had missed: a narrow side canyon, barely visible from their current position. You have 1 minute to comply, Patterson announced. After that, we'll be forced to take the documents by whatever means necessary. Elena leaned close to Luke, her voice barely audible. Can you see what Sentinel's looking at? Luke nodded slightly. Side canyon, maybe 20 yards ahead. Think we can make it? Not all of us. Those are professional shooters up there. Luke made his decision quickly. The badge in his saddlebags carried the authority of federal law, and Jake's investigation represented justice for honest people throughout the territory. Neither could be allowed to fall into Morrison's hands. Miss Vasquez is right. Luke called up to Patterson. Whitmore was investigating corruption, not participating in it. The documents prove Morrison and his associates have been stealing territorial resources. 30 seconds, Cowboy. Don't make this harder than necessary. Luke gathered Rosie's reins, preparing for the desperate run to the side canyon. Elena understood his intent, checking her pistol one final time. Sentinel moved into position, as if he too recognized the plan. Those documents stay with us, Luke shouted. If you want them, come down here and take them. Patterson's response was immediate rifle fire, cracked from multiple positions, bullets striking rocks around their position and sending stone chips flying. Luke spurred Rosie toward the side canyon, Elena matching his pace while Sentinel galloped ahead to scout the route. More gunfire erupted as they reached the canyon mouth, but the narrow opening limited the agents' angles of fire. Luke felt a bullet tug at his hat brim, but they made it into the protective confines of the side passage. The narrow canyon wound through solid rock, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Luke could hear pursuit behind them. Patterson's men weren't giving up easily. But Sentinel seemed to know where he was going, leading them through turns and passages that appeared on Jake's map as emergency escape routes. This connects to the old Apache trail system, Elena called, consulting her copy of Jake's notes. If we can reach the main passage, we might be able to lose them in the maze. They rode hard through increasingly narrow confines, trusting Sentinel's memory of riding this country with Jake. The Mustang's sure-footed navigation led them through passages that would have challenged experienced Apache warriors, let alone Pinkerton agents unfamiliar with the territory. Behind them, echoing gunshots indicated Patterson's men were still in pursuit, but the sound was growing more distant. The canyon system was working in their favor, creating a maze that favored local knowledge over superior numbers. There, Elena pointed ahead to where the canyon opened into a wider valley. Jake's second cache should be in those rock formations. They emerged into afternoon sunlight, finding themselves in a hidden valley that showed no signs of recent human presence. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the canyon walls, and a small spring created a green oasis in the desert landscape. This was sacred ground to the Apache, which explained why Jake had chosen it for hiding evidence. Sentinel led them directly to a pile of seemingly random boulders near the spring. Elena dismounted and began searching for Jake's markers, while Luke kept watch for pursuit. The Pinkerton agents would find their way through the canyon maze eventually, but they'd bought precious time. Here, Elena called softly, indicating a small symbol carved into one of the rocks. She moved several stones to reveal a waterproof container wedged into a natural crevice. Inside were more documents, financial records showing payments from mining companies to territorial officials, correspondence between Morrison and Confederates in other territories, and most damning of all, a telegraph message bearing Morrison's signature authorizing permanent removal of obstacles to territorial development. "This is Jake's murder order," Elena whispered, holding the telegraph with trembling hands. Morrison signed his death warrant. Luke felt cold anger settle in his chest as he read the coded language that meant death for an honest lawman. How many others has he killed? Jake suspected at least 6 disappearances were connected to Morrison's operation. Surveyors who found inconvenient mineral deposits, Apache leaders who refused to sell treaty rights, territorial officials who asked too many questions. They were securing the new documents when Sentinel's warning whinny alerted them to approaching riders. Luke grabbed his rifle and moved to a defensive position among the rocks, Elena beside him with her pistol ready. But the riders who emerged from the canyon weren't Pinkerton agents. They were Apache warriors, painted for war and armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and modern rifles. Luke counted at least 8, with more likely hidden in positions around the valley. The lead warrior was a man of perhaps 40, scarred from old battles, but moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in this harsh country. He raised his hand in a gesture that seemed more curious than hostile, then spoke in accented but clear English. "You are the ones who carry dead Marshal's papers." Luke kept his rifle ready but didn't aim it. "We're trying to finish Marshal Whitmore's work." The Apache leader nodded slowly. "Marshal Jake was good man. He speak truth about Agent Morrison's lies." He gestured toward the hidden documents. "Morrison steal our land with false papers, kill our leaders who refuse to sign." Elena stepped forward, her voice respectful. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I worked with Marshal Whitmore. I know you, truth woman. Marshal Jake speak of you before Morrison's men kill him." The warrior's expression hardened. "We track Pinkerton men who hunt you. They come soon." Luke realized they'd found unexpected allies. "Will you help us get these documents to honest authorities?" The Apache leader considered this, consulting with his warriors in their own language before responding. "Morrison's corruption, poison our land, steal our children's future. We help you reach safety, but you must promise justice for Marshal Jake's death." "I promise," Luke said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Then we go now. Pinkerton men bring many riders, too many for this valley to hide." The Apache warriors moved with practiced efficiency, helping Luke and Elena prepare for immediate departure. Sentinel seemed comfortable with their new allies, which Luke took as a positive sign. Jake must have worked with these same men during his investigation. As they prepared to leave the hidden valley, Luke reflected on how much his life had changed since finding that buried chest. 3 days ago, he'd been a drifting cowhand with no purpose beyond the next day's wages. Now he was carrying the authority of a federal marshal, allied with territorial investigators and Apache warriors, hunted by corrupt officials and their hired killers. But he was also closer to Elena than he'd been to anyone in years, and Sentinel's loyalty reminded him daily that some bonds transcended species and circumstances. Jake's investigation was becoming Luke's calling, and he was discovering reserves of courage and determination he hadn't known he possessed. The sound of distant gunfire indicated Patterson's men had found the valley entrance. Time to move, carrying Jake's evidence toward whatever justice awaited in the territorial capital. Behind them, corrupt authority pursued with legal warrants and federal badges. Ahead lay uncertain allies and the slim hope that truth might still triumph over organized greed. Luke secured Jake's badge in his shirt pocket, feeling its weight against his heart. Marshal Jacob Whitmore's investigation would be completed, one way or another. The dead deserved justice, and the living deserved truth. The Apache warriors led them through country that seemed impassable to outside eyes, hidden trails that wound between towering rock formations, passages that required dismounting and leading horses through narrow defiles. and water sources known only to those who'd lived in this land for generations. Their leader, who'd introduced himself as Nietzsche, rode beside Luke as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "Marshal Jake learned these paths from my father," he explained. "He understands that knowing the land means knowing the people who belong to it." Luke was beginning to appreciate the depth of Jake's preparation for his investigation. The Marshal hadn't just gathered evidence, he'd built relationships with people who could provide information and assistance when official channels proved corrupt. "How long did you work with Whitmore?" Luke asked. 2 seasons. He come to our village, speak truth about Agent Morrison's lies, show us papers that prove Morrison sell our land to mining companies before we sign any treaty. Nietzsche's voice carried controlled anger. "Morrison tell us we must move to smaller reservation, but Marshal Jake prove the treaties Morrison show us are false." Elena, riding ahead with several other warriors, turned back to join the conversation. Jake discovered that Morrison was creating fraudulent treaties, then using them to justify land transfers. The mining companies were paying him for advance information about mineral deposits on tribal lands. And when tribal leaders refused to accept the false treaties, Luke already suspected the answer. They disappeared, Nietzsche confirmed grimly, or died in what Morrison called hunting accidents or Apache raids by hostile bands. My uncle was one of those killed shot while riding alone near the reservation boundary. The pieces of Morrison's conspiracy were becoming clearer with each revelation. The Indian agent had been systematically eliminating opposition to his land grab scheme, using his official position to cover murder with bureaucratic explanations. Jake's investigation had threatened to expose the entire operation. They reached a vantage point that overlooked miles of desert country, and Nietzsche called a halt to rest the horses and plan their next move. In the distance, dust clouds marked the movement of multiple groups of riders, all converging on their general area. "Pinkerton men bring many friends," Nietzsche observed, studying the approaching riders through field glasses. "Morrison must want those papers very badly." Elena consulted Jake's map, tracing routes to the remaining cache points. "The third location is in the Superstition Mountains, the most dangerous cache because it contains Morrison's correspondence with Confederates in Washington. Evidence that the corruption reaches federal levels." Luke studied the terrain between their current position and the superstitions, noting how many different groups could intercept them along the way. "How many men does Morrison have available?" "Officially, maybe a dozen Pinkerton agents and territorial deputies under his influence," Elena replied. "Unofficially, the Joaquin brothers gang, plus other outlaws who found it profitable to work for him. Could be 50 men or more, all claiming legal authority to stop us." Nietzsche handed the field glasses to Luke, pointing toward the largest dust cloud. "Those riders move like soldiers, organized, disciplined, not outlaws or hired guns." Luke focused the glasses on the distant formation, counting at least 20 riders moving in precise formation. "Cavalry, territorial militia," Elena identified grimly. "Morrison's called out the official forces. He's claiming we're foreign agents or Apache raiders, something that justifies military response." The scope of their opposition was becoming overwhelming. They weren't just fighting corrupt officials and hired killers, they were facing legitimate territorial authority, backed by military force. Even if they reached the final cache and gathered all of Jake's evidence, who would they present it to? "Governor Safford," Elena said, reading his thoughts. "He's the one who authorized my investigation, and he's been trying to clean up territorial administration. If we can reach him with the complete evidence package, he has the authority to request federal intervention. Can we trust him?" Elena hesitated before answering. Jake thought so. But Morrison has connections throughout territorial government. We won't know who's compromised until we try. Nietzsche had been listening to their conversation while watching the pursuing forces. "My people have another option. We take you to Mexico, let you present evidence to federal authorities from outside Morrison's reach." Luke considered this, weighing their chances of reaching Mexico alive against the risks of trying to navigate territorial politics. Either choice carried substantial dangers, but at least in Mexico, they wouldn't be fighting both outlaws and legitimate authority. "There's a problem with running to Mexico," Elena said quietly. "Morrison's been working with Mexican officials too. Part of his mining operation involves claims on both sides of the border. Jake's correspondence suggests the corruption network extends into Sonora. They were trapped between corrupt authority above and hostile territory below, with enemies converging from all directions." Luke felt the weight of Jake's badge in his pocket and made his decision. "We finish what Jake started, all the way to the end, whatever it takes." Nietzsche smiled approvingly. "Marshal Jake, choose his successor well, but we need better plan than running from cache to cache with half of Arizona territory hunting us." Elena spread Jake's map on a flat rock, weighing down the corners with stones. "Jake's final cache isn't just in the superstitions, it's at his main base of operations, the place where he gathered all his evidence before attempting to present it to authorities." She pointed to a location marked with multiple symbols and detailed notations. Hidden valley, natural fortifications, supplied with food and ammunition. Jake called it the last stand, his final refuge if the investigation was compromised. Luke studied the location, noting how it was positioned to control access routes through the mountains. He was planning for exactly this situation. Jake always said that fighting corruption was like fighting a war. You needed supply lines, defensible positions, and allies you could trust absolutely. Elena's voice carried pride mixed with sorrow. He spent months preparing that base, expecting he'd eventually need to make a stand against Morrison's forces. Nietzsche traced potential routes to the hidden valley, calculating time and distance against their pursuers' likely movements. Difficult country, good for defense but hard to escape from. Once we go in, we stay until fight is finished. Then we'd better make sure we win, Luke said grimly. They remounted and began the dangerous journey toward Jake's final stronghold, knowing that each mile brought them closer to a confrontation that would determine the future of justice in Arizona territory. Behind them, corrupt authority mustered overwhelming force. Ahead lay a dead Marshal's preparations and the slim hope that right might still triumph over organized wrong. Sentinels seemed to sense their destination, moving with increasing purpose as familiar country appeared around them. The Mustang's memories of riding these trails with Jake would guide them to their final battlefield, the place where Marshal Jacob Whitmore's investigation would finally be completed, one way or another. Luke checked his rifle and counted his ammunition, preparing for whatever awaited in the hidden valley. Elena rode beside him with grim determination, while Nietzsche's warriors spread out to cover their flanks. Ahead lay the last stand, and with it the final test of whether one honest man's sacrifice could still change the world. The entrance to Jake's hidden valley was so well concealed that Luke would have ridden past it without Sentinel's guidance. The Mustang led them between two massive rock formations that appeared to form a solid wall, but careful navigation revealed a narrow passage that opened into a natural fortress. "Sweet Mother of God," Luke breathed, taking in the sight before them. Jake had chosen his location with the eye of a military engineer. The valley was perhaps 2 acres in size, surrounded by cliffs that rose 60 feet on all sides. Fresh water flowed from a spring at the far end, and natural caves provided shelter and storage. Most importantly, the only entrance could be held by a handful of defenders against overwhelming numbers. But it was the evidence of Jake's meticulous preparation that truly impressed Luke. Canvas-covered supplies were stacked in the caves, including ammunition, food, and medical supplies. A temporary corral held feed for horses, while defensive positions had been constructed at strategic points around the valley floor. "Jake spent 6 months preparing this place," Elena said, her voice heavy with emotion. "He knew the investigation would eventually force him into open conflict with Morrison's people." Nietzsche's warriors spread out to examine the defensive positions, nodding approvingly at Jake's tactical preparations. "Marshal Jake, think like warrior," Nietzsche observed. "Choose ground that favors few against many." Luke dismounted and began examining the supplies, finding everything organized with military precision. Jake had prepared for a siege, stockpiling enough resources to hold out for weeks if necessary. More importantly, he'd created a secure location for completing his investigation without interference. In the largest cave, Luke discovered Jake's field office maps covering the walls, filing boxes containing evidence, and a desk where the Marshal had continued his work even while hiding from Morrison's killers. Elena moved immediately to the desk, searching through papers with practiced efficiency. "This is it," she said quietly, holding up a leather-bound ledger. "Jake's master file on the Morrison conspiracy. Every transaction, every murder, every corrupt official, all documented with supporting evidence." Luke opened the ledger, scanning entries that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching far beyond Arizona territory. Morrison's network included officials in New Mexico, Nevada, and Colorado, all working together to exploit mineral rights and territorial resources. "Look at this." Elena pointed to a section marked Federal Connections. "Morrison has been reporting directly to someone in the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, not just regular reports, coded communications about territorial resources and political situations." Luke read the entries with growing anger. Jake had uncovered evidence that federal officials were using their positions to facilitate private exploitation of territorial resources, all while claiming to protect territorial interests and tribal rights. "How many people has Morrison killed to keep this quiet?" Luke asked. Elena consulted another section of the ledger. Jake documented 14 suspicious deaths over 3 years. Surveyors, tribal leaders, territorial officials, even a newspaper editor who started asking questions about land transfers. Naishe examined one of the wall maps, which showed the full scope of Morrison's mining claims throughout the Southwest. Agent Morrison steal more land than any war chief in Apache history, but he used papers instead of rifles. They were interrupted by the sound of distant gunfire. Their pursuers had found the valley entrance. Luke moved to the defensive position Jake had constructed near the passage, noting how the Marshal had created overlapping fields of fire that would make assault extremely costly. "How many?" Elena called, joining him with her rifle. Luke counted muzzle flashes among the rocks outside the valley. "At least 20, probably more. They're testing our defenses. They'll try to starve us out," Nietzsche predicted, taking position with 3 of his warriors. "Morrison cannot afford direct assault. Too many witnesses, too much noise. He needs us to disappear quietly." But even as he spoke, more gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Morrison's forces weren't content to wait. They were probing for weaknesses in the valley's defenses, looking for ways to breach Jake's carefully constructed fortress. "There," Elena pointed to movement on the eastern cliff face. "Climbers, trying to reach the rim." Luke adjusted his aim and fired, sending the lead climber tumbling back down the rock face. But more were attempting the ascent from different directions, forcing the defenders to spread their attention among multiple threats. "They have us outnumbered 10 to 1, Luke observed grimly. "Maybe more," Elena agreed. "But Jake chose this ground for a reason. They can't use their numbers effectively in terrain like this." As if to prove her point, an attempted charge at the valley entrance was stopped cold by concentrated fire from the defensive positions. Morrison's men were forced to retreat, leaving 2 wounded behind. The natural fortress was holding. But Luke knew they couldn't withstand indefinite siege. Eventually, Morrison would bring up enough men to overwhelm their defenses, or simply wait until their ammunition ran out. They needed a way to break the stalemate. "The real question," Elena said, reading his thoughts, "is whether Morrison can afford to keep this many men engaged for the time it would take to starve us out. Every hour this continues increases the chance that honest authorities will investigate." Naichi pointed toward a section of the cliff where several Apache warriors had taken concealed positions. "My people know paths through these mountains that no white man has seen. We can get word to territorial governor, tell him Morrison's true purpose here." Luke considered this. weighing their chances of survival against the importance of getting Jake's evidence to authorities who could act on it. The ledger in Elena's hands contained enough information to destroy Morrison's entire network, but only if it reached the right people. How long would it take your men to reach Governor Safford? 3 days hard riding, maybe 4 if territorial militia tried to stop them. Elena examined Jake's notes about Governor Safford's trustworthiness, finding entries that suggested the governor was honest, but politically cautious. Jake thought Safford would act on solid evidence, but only if he was confident of support from federal authorities. Then we give him that confidence. Luke decided. Send your fastest riders to Prescott with copies of the most damning evidence. Make sure Safford understands this is bigger than territorial corruption. It's federal crime. Nietzsche selected 2 of his youngest warriors, men who could ride hard and fast through country they'd known since childhood. Elena prepared copies of the most critical documents, including Morrison's correspondence with federal officials and evidence of the murders he'd ordered. As the messengers prepared to leave through hidden paths that even Morrison's Apache scouts wouldn't know, more gunfire erupted around the valley rim. Morrison's forces were increasing pressure, perhaps sensing that their quarry was planning something. Whatever happens, Elena said quietly, Jake's investigation will be completed. His evidence will reach authorities who can act on it. Luke nodded, checking his rifle and counting remaining ammunition. They might not survive the siege, but Jake's sacrifice would finally achieve its purpose. Justice would be served, even if it came at the cost of their lives. Sentinel moved to Luke's side, the Mustang's presence a reminder of the loyalty that had brought them this far. Jake's horse understood the stakes as clearly as his human companions. Sometimes standing ground was more important than survival. Marshal Jake would be proud, Nietzsche observed, watching the Apache messengers disappear into mountain passages that would take them safely around Morrison's forces. Luke touched the badge in his pocket, feeling its weight as both burden and authority. In 3 days, Jake's investigation would finally reach honest officials who could demand justice. Until then, they'd hold this valley against whatever Morrison could bring against them. The siege of the last stand had begun, and with it, the final chapter of Marshal Jacob Whitmore's quest for truth. The siege continued through the night, with Morrison's forces maintaining steady pressure while avoiding costly direct assaults. Luke rotated watch duties with Elena and Nietzsche's remaining warriors, catching what sleep they could between sporadic gunfire and probing attacks. Dawn brought an unexpected development. A white flag appeared at the valley entrance, carried by a single rider who approached with careful deliberation. Luke recognized the man immediately, Agent Patterson, the Pinkerton operative who'd tried to trap them in the canyon. "I'd like to speak with whoever's in charge," Patterson called out, staying well within rifle range but making no threatening moves. Luke emerged from cover, rifle ready but not aimed. "Say your piece." "I have a proposition from Agent Morrison. He's willing to negotiate a peaceful resolution to this situation." Elena joined Luke, her expression skeptical. "Morrison doesn't negotiate, he eliminates problems." Patterson smiled without warmth. "Circumstances have changed, Miss Vasquez. Agent Morrison has received new instructions from Washington regarding this investigation." "What kind of instructions?" Luke demanded. "The kind that authorize him to offer you official positions in exchange for your cooperation. Federal Deputy Marshal for you, Mr. Mercer. Special Investigator status for Miss Vasquez. Full pardons for your Apache allies." Luke felt suspicion crawling up his spine like a rattlesnake. Morrison's sudden willingness to negotiate didn't match the pattern of ruthless elimination they'd witnessed so far. "In exchange for what?" Elena asked. "The documents you've collected, of course. And your agreement to cease this unauthorized investigation." Patterson's tone remained professionally pleasant, but his eyes held the coldness Luke had learned to associate with corruption. "And if we refuse? Then Agent Morrison will be forced to take more decisive action. He has authorization to use whatever force necessary to recover stolen federal property and apprehend foreign agents operating in territorial waters. Luke started to respond, but Elena's sharp intake of breath stopped him. She was staring at something behind Patterson, additional riders approaching the valley entrance. "That's Governor Safford," she whispered. Luke recognized the territorial governor from newspaper photographs, a distinguished man in his 50s, accompanied by a small escort of territorial officials. But something was wrong with the picture. Safford was riding beside Agent Morrison, the two men conversing with obvious familiarity. "As you can see," Patterson continued, noting their observation, "Agent Morrison has the full support of territorial authority for his actions here." Elena's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Governor Safford authorized my investigation." "Governor Safford authorized an investigation into corruption, Miss Vasquez. An investigation that Agent Morrison has been conducting all along. Your amateur interference has complicated his carefully planned operation." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't just corrupted territorial officials, he'd manipulated them into believing he was the solution to territorial corruption, not its primary cause. "Jake's investigation," Luke began. Marshal Whitmore was a rogue agent whose unauthorized activities threatened a sensitive federal operation, Patterson interrupted. Agent Morrison tried to bring him in quietly, but Whitmore resisted arrest and died in the ensuing confrontation. Luke felt rage building in his chest, but Elena's touch on his arm warned him to stay calm. They needed to understand the full scope of Morrison's deception before making any rash moves. Governor Safford rode closer to the valley entrance, his voice carrying easily in the desert air. "Miss Vasquez, I'm disappointed in your actions. Agent Morrison has provided evidence that you've been working with foreign agents to steal territorial resources." "Governor, that's not true," Elena called back. "Morrison is the one stealing territorial resources. We have evidence. Evidence manufactured by Apache raiders and their criminal associates." Morrison's voice cut across hers. The Indian agent rode into view, wearing the confident expression of a man who'd outmaneuvered his enemies completely. "Evidence that my investigation has already proven to be falsified." Luke studied Morrison's face, seeing intelligence and ruthless calculation behind the facade of concerned official. This was a man who'd spent years building an unassailable position, surrounding himself with layers of official protection and legal justification. "You killed Jake," Elena accused. "Marshal Whitmore died resisting arrest after being caught stealing federal evidence," Morrison replied smoothly. "His death was regrettable but necessary to protect territorial security." Nietzsche emerged from the rocks, his rifle trained on Morrison. "Agent Morrison speak with forked tongue. He kill Apache leaders, steal our land with false papers. The testimony of hostile Apache has no legal standing in territorial courts," Morrison responded, "especially when those Apache are clearly working with foreign agents to destabilize territorial government." Luke realized the full brilliance of Morrison's strategy. By positioning himself as the official investigator of corruption, he'd gained legal authority to eliminate anyone who threatened his operations. Jake's murder became justified law enforcement. Elena's investigation became foreign interference. Their Apache allies became hostile raiders. "What's your real proposition?" Luke asked Patterson. "Simple. You surrender the stolen documents and submit to debriefing about your foreign contacts. In exchange, you'll be processed through normal legal channels rather than being dealt with as enemy agents." Elena leaned close to Luke, her voice barely audible. "He's lying. Morrison can't afford to let us live. We know too much about his real operations." Luke nodded slightly, understanding. Morrison's offer was designed to get them to surrender voluntarily, making their subsequent elimination appear legal and justified. Once they were in custody, they'd suffer accidents or be shot while attempting to escape. "I need time to consider your offer," Luke called to Patterson. "You have 1 hour," the Pinkerton agent replied. After that, Governor Safford has authorized Agent Morrison to take whatever action he deems necessary to resolve this situation. The officials withdrew to a safe distance, leaving Luke and his companions to contemplate their impossible situation. Morrison had turned their own authorities against them, making resistance appear criminal while his corruption masqueraded as law enforcement. Jake suspected something like this, Elena said quietly, consulting his ledger. Look at this entry from 2 weeks before he disappeared. Luke read Jake's careful handwriting. Morrison's greatest strength is his ability to make his crimes appear legal. He's convinced territorial officials that he's investigating corruption, not perpetrating it. If my investigation is discovered, he'll use official authority to eliminate me while claiming to be protecting territorial interests. Smart man, Nietzsche observed grimly. He see trap closing around him. Luke studied the Hidden Valley's defenses, calculating their chances of holding out against a legitimate territorial assault backed by federal authority. Even if they survived, they'd be branded as criminals and foreign agents, their evidence dismissed as manufactured propaganda. There has to be another way, he muttered. Elena was examining another section of Jake's ledger, her expression growing thoughtful. Maybe there is. Look at this. Jake discovered Morrison's real weakness. She pointed to an entry marked insurance policy. Morrison's correspondence with federal officials contains evidence of treason. He's been selling territorial information to Mexican interests while claiming to investigate foreign interference. If this evidence reaches the right federal authorities, Morrison's protection becomes his liability. Luke understood immediately. Morrison's federal connections were based on his supposed loyalty to territorial interests. If those same federal officials learned he was actually working with foreign agents, they'd abandon him instantly to protect themselves. The question is, Elena continued, how do we get that evidence to federal authorities without going through territorial channels Morrison controls? Nietzsche smiled grimly. My messengers carry more than territorial evidence. They carry proof of Morrison's treason to military authorities at Fort Whipple, men who answer to Washington, not territorial government. Luke felt hope rekindling in his chest. Morrison's carefully constructed facade depended on controlling information flow to federal authorities. If the military received evidence of his treason independent of territorial channels, his protection would evaporate instantly. How long before your men reach Fort Whipple? By tonight, if they ride hard. Federal response, maybe 2 days. Luke checked his rifle and counted ammunition. They needed to hold the valley for another 48 hours, while Morrison's federal protection crumbled around him. It would be the longest 2 days of their lives, but justice for Jake and for Arizona territory hung in the balance. Morrison thought he'd won by turning territorial authority against them. He was about to learn that some kinds of corruption carried consequences even federal protection couldn't prevent. The hour deadline passed without surrender, and Morrison's response was swift and overwhelming. By noon, Luke counted more than 60 men surrounding the Valley Territorial Militia, Pinkerton agents, deputized civilians, and the Joaquin Brothers gang, all operating under official authority to suppress what Morrison had labeled a foreign-sponsored uprising. They're building siege works, Elena observed, studying the activity through field glasses. Morrison's planning a prolonged campaign. Luke nodded grimly, watching teams of men construct earthworks and firing positions around the valley rim. Morrison was taking no chances. He intended to reduce Jake's fortress methodically, using superior numbers and official sanction to justify whatever level of force proved necessary. How's our ammunition situation? He asked Nietzsche. The Apache warrior checked their remaining supplies with practiced efficiency. Maybe enough for 1 day of heavy fighting. Jake prepare well, but not for army-sized force. Elena continued reading through Jake's ledger, searching for any advantage the Marshal might have built into his preparations. There's something here about contingency plans. Jake mentions final option if the valley becomes untenable. She led them to a section of cave they hadn't fully explored, where Jake had concealed his most sensitive materials. Behind a carefully constructed false wall, they discovered additional supplies and something that made Luke whistle with appreciation, a small arsenal of military-grade explosives. Jake was planning to destroy the evidence rather than let it fall into Morrison's hands, Elena realized. These charges are positioned to bring down half the valley if necessary. Luke examined the explosives, noting Jake's careful placement and the detonation system he'd rigged. The Marshal had prepared for the possibility that his investigation might fail, but he'd ensured that his evidence wouldn't be used to justify further corruption. "Could we use these offensively?" Luke asked. "Turn Jake's last resort into our advantage?" Nietzsche studied the explosive placements with the eye of a warrior who'd fought against military engineers. "Maybe cave system extends beyond this valley. Apache used these passages for generations. Explosives could block pursuit routes, create new defensive positions." Elena consulted Jake's detailed maps of the area, finding notations about the extensive cave network that honeycombed the mountain. Jake mapped the whole system. He knew about passages that connect to other valleys, even routes that reach the main territorial road. Luke felt a plan beginning to form. Morrison's siege depended on containing them in the valley, while systematic reduction wore down their defenses. But if they could use Jake's explosives to alter the tactical situation, they might survive long enough for federal intervention to arrive. "Show me these passages," he said to Nietzsche. The Apache warrior led them through narrow openings in the valley's rear wall, following ancient paths that wound through solid rock. The passages were barely wide enough for a man, but they opened into larger chambers and eventually connected to other parts of the mountain system. "This passage leads to canyon where we can reach horses," Nietzsche explained. "This one goes to place overlooking main road, good position for watching cavalry approach." Elena studied Jake's notes about the cave system, finding detailed observations about defensive possibilities and escape routes. Jake planned this perfectly. He knew Morrison would bring overwhelming force, so he prepared alternatives to direct confrontation. They spent the afternoon rigging Jake's explosives according to a plan that would give them maximum tactical advantage. Charges in the main passage could be detonated to prevent assault while opening access to the cave system. Others were positioned to create new firing positions or block specific approaches to the valley. "It's dangerous," Luke admitted as they completed preparations. "One mistake and we bring the whole mountain down on ourselves." "Jake's calculations were always precise," Elena said with quiet confidence. "He tested these placements carefully before positioning the charges." As evening approached, Morrison's forces lit torches around the valley rim, preparing for night operations. Luke could see sharpshooters taking position on the cliffs, their rifles aimed at every visible defensive position in the valley below. "They'll attack tonight," Nietzsche predicted. "Morrison cannot afford to wait longer, too much chance of federal questions about what happens here." Luke checked the detonation system one final time, ensuring they could trigger Jake's charges quickly if the situation became desperate. Elena prepared copies of the most critical evidence, planning to carry them through the cave system if retreat became necessary. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "Jake's investigation ends tonight. Either Morrison's corruption is exposed or he succeeds in burying the truth permanently." Sentinel moved restlessly around the valley, the Mustang's keen senses detecting the tension that filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The horse seemed to understand that the final confrontation was approaching, the moment when Jake's sacrifice would either achieve its purpose or be rendered meaningless. Luke positioned himself at the main defensive works, rifle ready and detonation controls within easy reach. Elena took a firing position that commanded the valley entrance, while Nietzsche and his remaining warriors prepared to defend the secondary approaches. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Morrison's voice echoed across the valley from a position protected by earthworks. "This is your final opportunity to surrender peacefully. You're surrounded by legitimate territorial authority, and resistance will be met with appropriate force." Luke didn't respond. He'd passed the point where words mattered. Now only actions would determine whether justice or corruption triumphed in Arizona territory. "You have 1 minute to throw down your weapons and submit to arrest," Morrison continued. "After that, we'll be forced to take decisive action." Luke touched Jake's badge in his pocket, feeling its weight as both burden and authority. In the distance, signal fires flickered on mountain peaks. Nietzsche's messengers had reached their destinations and were spreading word of Morrison's true activities. Federal cavalry would be riding through the night, but whether they'd arrive in time remained uncertain. 60 seconds, Morrison called. Elena moved to Luke's position, her voice steady despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "Jake's final letter. I haven't shown it to you yet." She handed him a sealed envelope marked, "To my successor," in Jake's careful handwriting. Luke opened it carefully, reading by the light of their concealed lantern. "If you're reading this, then my investigation has cost me my life, but not its purpose. The evidence you've gathered will restore honest government to Arizona territory, but only if good people are willing to fight for justice when the law itself has been corrupted. The badge you carry isn't just symbol, it's a promise that right will triumph over wrong, no matter the cost. Make me proud, Marshal." Luke folded the letter carefully, understanding the full weight of responsibility Jake had passed to him. This wasn't just about exposing Morrison's corruption, it was about proving that individual courage could still change the world when institutions failed. 30 seconds. Morrison's voice carried a note of satisfaction, as if he relished the approaching violence. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions around the valley rim, bullets striking the defensive works and sending stone chips flying. Morrison's assault had begun, with sharpshooters providing covering fire for teams advancing down the cliff faces. Luke returned fire carefully, making each shot count while conserving ammunition for the extended battle ahead. Elena's marksmanship proved exceptional, her shots finding targets among the advancing assault teams with deadly precision. "Climbing teams on the north wall," Nietzsche called, directing his warriors' fire toward silhouettes moving against the star-filled sky. Luke triggered the first explosive charge, bringing down a section of cliff face that crushed several climbing teams and blocked that approach permanently. The blast echoed through the mountains like thunder, momentarily silencing the rifle fire as Morrison's forces regrouped. "That showed them we're serious," Elena said grimly, "but it also told them about Jake's explosives." More gunfire erupted, heavier now as Morrison committed larger numbers to the assault. Luke could see muzzle flashes from at least 30 positions, all concentrating fire on their defensive works. The natural fortress was holding, but barely. "Second wave coming," Nietzsche warned, pointing toward fresh movement on the eastern approaches. Luke waited until the assault teams were committed to their positions before triggering another charge, this one creating a new firing position while blocking the main approach route. The explosion revealed Morrison's tactical problem. He could bring overwhelming force to bear, but the terrain limited how many men he could employ effectively. "Movement in the caves," Elena reported, having positioned herself to watch the passages Jake had mapped. Luke realized Morrison had found local guides familiar with the cave system. The siege was becoming a multi-dimensional battle, with conflicts raging on the surface and underground simultaneously. Time to use Jake's final contingency, he decided, moving toward the master detonation controls. Elena understood immediately. The main charges, that brings down half the mountain. Better than letting Morrison capture Jake's evidence and use it to justify further corruption. But even as Luke reached for the detonation controls, Sentinel's piercing whinny cut through the gunfire. The Mustang was pointing toward the main road, ears pricked forward in excitement rather than alarm. Through the darkness, Luke could see distant torches moving in organized formation. Cavalry, riding hard toward the valley, but whose cavalry? Federal forces, responding to Nietzsche's evidence, or more territorial militia answering Morrison's calls for reinforcement? Federal cavalry, Elena identified, studying the approaching formation through field glasses. "I can see their guidons, their flying federal colors, not territorial." Morrison's voice rose above the gunfire, shouting orders to his forces. "Concentrate fire on the valley floor. We need to finish this." Before, his words were cut off by a new voice, amplified by a speaking trumpet and carrying the unmistakable authority of military command. "This is Colonel Williams, United States Cavalry. Cease fire immediately and identify yourselves." The gunfire slackened as Morrison's forces tried to understand this new development. Luke held his fire as well, waiting to see how the situation would develop. "Agent Morrison, Bureau of Indian Affairs," came the reply from the earthworks. "We're conducting operations against foreign agents and hostile Apache. Request immediate assistance in suppressing rebellion." "Agent Morrison, you're under arrest for treason and conspiracy against the United States government." Colonel Williams responded, "Evidence of your criminal activities has been presented to federal authorities. Surrender yourself and your men immediately." Luke felt relief washing over him like cool water in the desert heat. Nietzsche's messengers had succeeded. Federal intervention had arrived before Morrison could complete his elimination of the witnesses against him. But Morrison's response showed the desperation of a man who'd built his entire position on carefully maintained deceptions. "Colonel, you've been misinformed by enemy propaganda. I'm conducting official territorial business under federal authority." "Your federal authority has been revoked, Agent Morrison. Surrender now or face the consequences of continued resistance to legitimate federal forces." Luke could see confusion spreading through Morrison's forces as men tried to understand whether they were supporting or opposing federal authority. The territorial militia began lowering their weapons, unwilling to fire on United States cavalry. But the Joaquin brothers and Pinkerton agents had too much invested in Morrison's success to surrender peacefully. Gunfire erupted from their positions, aimed now at both the valley defenders and the approaching federal forces. "Take cover," Luke shouted, realizing the battle was entering its final, most dangerous phase. Morrison's remaining allies would fight desperately, knowing that capture meant prison or death for their crimes. The siege of the last stand had become a three-way battle, with federal cavalry advancing against desperate criminals, while Luke and his companions held the center. Jake's investigation was finally reaching its climax, but the outcome remained uncertain as gunfire lit up the Arizona night. The three-way battle erupted with devastating intensity as Morrison's remaining forces found themselves caught between federal cavalry and Luke's defensive positions. The Pinkerton agents and Joaquin brothers fought with the desperation of men who knew surrender meant the gallows, while the territorial militia scattered in confusion. Luke watched through the chaos as Morrison himself emerged from the earthworks, no longer the confident bureaucrat, but a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The Indian agent carried a rifle and moved with military precision, directing his remaining allies toward positions that might allow escape through the mountain passes. "He's making for the North Trail," Elena called, tracking Morrison's movement through her rifle scope. "If he reaches the horses..." Her shot shattered rock near Morrison's position, forcing him to dive for cover, but not stopping his advance toward the escape route. Luke realized that even with federal cavalry arriving, Morrison might still slip away to rebuild his criminal network elsewhere. "Nietzsche, can your men cut off the North Trail?" The Apache warrior was already moving, leading his remaining fighters through passages that would let them emerge ahead of Morrison's retreat. "We stop him, but need covering fire from valley positions." Luke triggered another of Jake's explosive charges, bringing down a section of cliff that blocked one potential escape route while revealing Morrison's position to the advancing cavalry. The blast illuminated the Indian agent's face for a moment, showing features twisted by rage and desperation. Colonel Williams' cavalry had reached the outer perimeter of Morrison's siege works, engaging the Pinkerton agents in fierce, close-quarters combat. Luke could hear the distinctive crack of military carbines mixed with the heavier reports of civilian rifles, punctuated by shouts and the screaming of wounded horses. "Patterson's rallying the Pinkertons for a final stand," Elena observed, watching the remaining agents consolidate around their leader's position. "They're going to try to fight their way out." Luke checked his ammunition, running dangerously low after hours of sustained combat. Jake's preparations had been thorough, but not designed for this level of prolonged fighting. They needed to end this quickly before their resources were exhausted. Sentinels suddenly reared and trumpeted a warning that cut through the gunfire like a blade. The Mustang was pointing toward the main cave entrance, where movement in the shadows indicated Morrison had found another route toward escape. "Cave system," Luke realized. "He's using Jake's own passages against us." Elena moved immediately toward the cave mouth, but Luke caught her arm. "Too dangerous. He could be waiting in ambush. Then how do we stop him?" Luke looked at the master detonation controls for Jake's final contingency, the charges that would bring down the entire cave system and seal Morrison inside permanently. But using them would also destroy all of Jake's evidence, leaving no proof of the conspiracy beyond Naiche's copies. "There's another way," he decided, grabbing his rifle and moving toward the cave entrance. Jake's investigation ends where it began, with one honest man willing to do what's right. Elena tried to follow, but Luke shook his head firmly. "Someone needs to protect the evidence. If I don't make it back, Colonel Williams will need every document to prosecute the surviving conspirators." He entered the cave system that Jake had mapped so carefully, following passages lit by the faint glow of Morrison's torch ahead. The Indian agent was moving quickly but not quietly. Desperation had overcome his usual calculating caution. Luke caught up with Morrison in the central chamber, where Jake had stored his most sensitive files. The Indian agent was frantically gathering documents, probably hoping to destroy evidence that could link him to other conspirators. "It's over, Morrison," Luke announced, stepping into the chamber with his rifle ready. Morrison spun around, his own weapon coming up smoothly. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the space where Jake had worked to expose the truth about territorial corruption. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," Morrison snarled. "Arizona territory needs strong leadership, not bleeding heart idealism. My methods brought order to chaos." "Your methods brought murder and theft," Luke replied. "Jake documented 14 people you killed to protect your operations. Necessary sacrifices for territorial development. You think this land would have prospered under Apache control or territorial bureaucrats? I made it profitable." Luke saw no remorse in Morrison's eyes, only frustrated ambition and the kind of arrogance that justified any crime in service of personal gain. This was a man who'd convinced himself that corruption was patriotism, that theft was development. "Jake's evidence will make sure you never hurt anyone again." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Jake's evidence? You mean the documents I've been planting and modifying for months? Everything you think you know about my activities has been carefully orchestrated to frame my political enemies." Luke felt cold realization creeping up his spine. "You're lying, am I? Check the dates on those financial records. Examine the handwriting on those correspondence files. Your precious Marshal Whitmore was gathering evidence I wanted him to find, building a case against men who threatened my real operations." The possibility that Jake's investigation had been manipulated from the beginning struck Luke like a physical blow. If Morrison was telling the truth, then everything they'd fought for might be based on fabricated evidence. "Even if that's true," Luke said steadily, "the killings were real, the land thefts were real, Jake's death was real." Jake's death was unfortunate but necessary. He was getting too close to my actual operations, not the ones I was framing my enemies for. Morrison was edging toward another passage, one that Luke couldn't see clearly in the torch-lit darkness. The Indian agent's confidence suggested he still believed he could escape and rebuild his operations elsewhere. "You won't make it out of these mountains," Luke warned. "Federal cavalry has the whole area surrounded." Federal cavalry following orders based on fabricated evidence that will be discredited within days, Morrison replied. I have allies in Washington who will ensure this incident is forgotten quickly. Luke realized that even capture might not end Morrison's threat to justice. Men with his level of federal connections could manipulate investigations, discredit witnesses, and emerge from apparent defeat stronger than before. The weight of Jake's badge seemed to pulse against Luke's chest, reminding him of the responsibility he'd inherited. Some fights couldn't be won through legal processes when the law itself had been corrupted beyond repair. Jake's real evidence isn't in these caves, Luke said quietly. Morrison's expression sharpened with sudden concern. What do you mean? Elena's been carrying the authentic documents all along. Jake suspected his caches might be compromised, so he created duplicates, some real, some false. The evidence Naich's men carried to federal authorities contains your actual correspondence, your real financial records, proof of your genuine crimes. Morrison's face went pale in the torchlight as he realized the implications. If authentic evidence had reached federal authorities independent of territorial channels, his carefully constructed defense would crumble completely. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake was smarter than you gave him credit for. He knew men like you always think they're the only ones capable of deception. The sound of approaching voices, Elena calling his name, Colonel Williams demanding Morrison's surrender, echoed through the cave system. Time was running out for both of them. Morrison's face contorted with rage as the full scope of his defeat became clear. The Indian agent raised his rifle, but Luke was faster, his shot echoing through the cave chamber like thunder. Morrison staggered backward, dropping his weapon as blood spread across his shirt. You've destroyed everything, Morrison gasped, falling against the cave wall. Years of careful planning, territorial development, bringing civilization to this wasteland. You brought corruption and murder, Luke replied, keeping his rifle trained on the wounded man. Jake's investigation will expose the truth about your operations. Morrison laughed bitterly, blood frothing at his lips. Truth? You still don't understand what you're dealing with. My network extends far beyond Arizona. Territory removing me just creates opportunity for others to step into the void. Then we'll stop them too. With what authority? Jake's badge, territorial law, federal bureaucrats who've been bought and sold a dozen times over. Morrison's voice was growing weaker, but his eyes still held malicious intelligence. I'm just one man in a system built on profitable corruption. Luke heard footsteps approaching through the cave passages, Elena's voice calling his name, accompanied by the heavier tread of military boots. Colonel Williams and his men had entered the cave system, following the sound of gunfire to its source. Luke, Elena's voice echoed from the main passage. Are you all right? In here, he called back, not taking his eyes off Morrison. The Indian agent was dying, but slowly, and his expression suggested he had more revelations to share. The Golden Cross, he whispered. Jake never found it, did he? Luke felt his blood chill. What Golden Cross? The Confederate gold. It was melted down and recast into religious artifacts. 12 crosses, each containing enough gold to fund territorial development for decades. I only controlled 3 of them. Elena appeared in the chamber entrance, followed by Colonel Williams and 2 cavalry troopers. The federal officer took in the scene quickly, Morrison bleeding against the cave wall, Luke standing over him with rifle ready. Agent Morrison, you're under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy against the United States government, Colonel Williams announced formally. Morrison's laugh turned into a coughing fit that sprayed blood across the cave floor. Arrest a dead man if it makes you feel better, Colonel. But ask yourself, who told you where to find this evidence? Who made sure you arrived at exactly the right moment? Luke exchanged glances with Elena, seeing the same suspicion growing in her eyes. Morrison's final revelation was suggesting that even their apparent victory had been orchestrated by unknown forces. Someone wanted Morrison eliminated. Elena realized quietly. Not arrested, eliminated. His death removes a loose end while allowing higher authorities to claim they've solved the corruption problem. Colonel Williams studied Morrison's dying form with professional interest. Who else is involved in this conspiracy, Agent Morrison? Ask your superiors. In Washington, Morrison gasped. Ask them, who benefits from territorial statehood? His head fell forward as life left his body, taking his secrets with him into whatever awaited beyond the grave. Luke felt both relief and frustration. Morrison would never hurt anyone again, but his death had cut off the trail leading to his Confederates. Sergeant Davies, secure this chamber and catalogue all documents, Colonel Williams ordered. Nothing leaves here without proper federal authorization. Luke watched as military efficiency took control of Jake's carefully gathered evidence. The investigation that had started with one honest marshal's determination to expose corruption was ending with federal bureaucrats deciding which truths would be revealed and which would remain hidden. Colonel, Elena said carefully, those documents contain evidence of crimes throughout the territorial administration. People have a right to know what was done in their name. Miss Vasquez, the documents will be reviewed by appropriate federal authorities and action will be taken as deemed necessary for territorial security. Williams' tone was professionally neutral, but Luke detected undertones of warning. What about justice for the people Morrison killed? Agent Morrison is dead, Miss Vasquez. Justice has been served. Luke felt anger building in his chest. What about his Confederates? Morrison said. His network extended beyond Arizona territory. Any additional investigations will be conducted through proper federal channels by appropriately authorized personnel. Elena's face had gone pale as she realized the implications. You're going to bury this, aren't you? Morrison's death will be blamed on outlaw activity. His crimes will be sealed as classified federal business, and nothing will change. Colonel Williams didn't deny the accusation. Miss Vasquez, you and Mr. Mercer have performed valuable service to your territory. I'm sure appropriate recognition will be forthcoming. We don't want recognition, Luke said firmly. We want justice. Justice, Mr. Mercer, is a complicated concept when national security interests are involved. Agent Morrison's crimes were serious, but exposing them publicly could damage federal authority throughout the territorial system. Luke understood now why Morrison had seemed almost relieved in his final moments. Even in death, the system that had enabled his corruption was protecting itself by ensuring that his crimes would never be fully revealed. But Jake's badge still rested against Luke's heart, carrying with it the weight of promises made to the dead and the living. Marshal Jacob Whitmore's investigation hadn't ended with Morrison's death. It had revealed something larger and more dangerous than one corrupt Indian agent. The golden crosses, Luke said quietly. Morrison mentioned 12 golden crosses made from the Confederate gold. He only controlled 3 of them. Colonel Williams' expression sharpened with sudden interest. What golden crosses? Elena consulted Jake's ledger quickly, finding references Morrison had made to religious artifacts and territorial funding. Jake suspected the missing gold had been converted into easily transportable forms. Crosses would be perfect, valuable, portable, and innocent-looking. Where are the other 9 crosses? Williams demanded. Luke smiled grimly, realizing they'd found leverage against the federal tendency to bury inconvenient truths. That information is in Jake's real evidence files, the ones that haven't been compromised by Morrison's manipulations. Which files? The ones Elena's been carrying all along, Luke replied. The authentic documents that prove Morrison's crimes and identify his Confederates throughout the territorial system. Williams studied Elena with calculating eyes. Miss Vasquez, those documents are now evidence in a federal investigation. They must be turned over to proper authorities. They will be, Elena agreed, as soon as we're certain those authorities can be trusted to use them for justice rather than cover-up. Luke felt Sentinel's presence in the cave entrance. The Mustang had found his way through the passages, drawn by loyalty and the need to be present for the conclusion of Jake's investigation. The horse stays with me, Luke announced, understanding that Sentinel represented continuity between Jake's mission and whatever came next. Colonel Williams nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing something in Luke's voice that warned against interference. "Very well, Mr. Mercer, but understand that this investigation is now a federal matter." "Understood," Luke replied. "But Jake's investigation doesn't end until all of Morrison's Confederates are brought to justice, no matter how high their positions or how powerful their connections." The cave fell silent, except for the distant sound of cavalry operations outside. Morrison was dead, but his network of corruption remained largely intact. Luke carried Jake's badge, and Elena carried Jake's evidence, while Sentinel stood ready to continue the mission that had cost one honest marshal his life. Justice for Jake and for Arizona Territory was still unfinished business. 6 months later, Luke stood in the territorial courthouse in Prescott, wearing the silver star of a United States Marshal pinned to his vest. The same badge that had belonged to Jake Whitmore now carried federal authority granted by special commission from Washington, recognition of the investigation that had exposed corruption, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Elena sat at the prosecutor's table, her role as special territorial investigator having evolved into permanent federal appointment. Together, they'd spent months following the trail Morrison had left behind, unraveling a network of corruption that stretched from Arizona to Colorado to Washington itself. The Golden Crosses had been the key to everything. Jake's authentic evidence had revealed their locations throughout the Southwest, each one funding corrupt operations in different territories. Recovery of the remaining 9 crosses had provided enough evidence to bring down territorial officials, federal bureaucrats, and business leaders whose greed had cost honest people their lives and their futures. "The jury finds the defendant guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, reading the verdict against the last of Morrison's major Confederates. Territorial Secretary Edmund Carstairs stood impassively as his fate was sealed, but Luke saw defeat in the man's eyes. Outside the courthouse, Sentinel waited patiently in the shade of an oak tree, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Mustang had become Luke's partner in the fullest sense, helping to track down evidence and suspects across hundreds of miles of harsh territory. More than that, Sentinel served as a living reminder of Jake's sacrifice and the responsibility that came with seeking justice in a land where justice was often scarce. "Carstairs will get 20 years in federal prison," Elena said, joining Luke on the courthouse steps. "That makes 11 major convictions from Morrison's network. Any word on the federal investigation?" 3 Bureau of Indian Affairs officials arrested last week, 2 territorial judges facing charges next month. The corruption went deeper than even Jake suspected. Luke nodded, satisfied that Jake's investigation was finally achieving its intended purpose. The dead marshal's careful documentation had provided federal prosecutors with enough evidence to clean house throughout the territorial administration. "Governor Safford wants to see us," Elena continued. "He's got a proposition." They walked through Prescott's bustling streets toward the territorial capital, noting the changes that had occurred since Morrison's death. Business was thriving as honest territorial government replaced corrupt exploitation, and relations with Apache bands had improved dramatically once legitimate officials took control of Indian affairs. Governor Safford received them in his office with obvious gratitude. The territorial governor had emerged from the Morrison scandal with his reputation enhanced, having cooperated fully with federal investigators and implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future corruption. "Marshal Mercer, Miss Vasquez, Arizona Territory, owes you both a debt that can never be fully repaid," Safford began. "Your investigation has restored honest government and paved the way for eventual statehood." "We just finished what Jake Whitmore started," Luke replied, "which is why I have a proposal for both of you. Arizona will achieve statehood within the next few years, and will need experienced law enforcement officials who understand the challenges we face. I'm offering you permanent positions, Marshal Mercer as Chief Territorial Marshal, Miss Vasquez as Director of Criminal Investigation. Elena and Luke exchanged glances, considering the opportunity to build on what they'd accomplished. The territorial system that had enabled Morrison's corruption was being replaced by institutions designed to serve honest citizens rather than corrupt officials. "There's one condition," Luke said finally. "Jake's investigation becomes part of territorial law enforcement training. Every deputy marshal, every territorial official, every federal representative needs to understand how corruption takes root and how honest people can fight it." "Agreed completely," Safford replied. "Marshal Whitmore's sacrifice will be remembered as the foundation of honest government in Arizona." That evening, Luke and Elena rode out to the desert location where Luke had first encountered Sentinel guarding Jake's buried chest. The site had been marked with a simple stone monument bearing Jake's name and the dates of his service, but Luke had wanted to return to where it all began. Sentinel grazed peacefully nearby, while Luke and Elena sat watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. The harsh country that had tested their courage and commitment stretched endlessly in all directions, still dangerous but no longer poisoned by systematic corruption. "Jake would be proud," Elena said quietly, touching the silver locket that still contained his photograph. "He'd probably say the work's just beginning," Luke replied. "Cleaning up Morrison's network was the easy part. Building something better will take years. Are you ready for that kind of commitment?" Luke considered the question seriously, weighing the comfortable life of a federal marshal against the challenges of helping build a new state from territorial foundations. But Jake's badge seemed to pulse with its own weight of responsibility, reminding him that some duties transcended personal comfort. "Someone has to do it," he said finally. "Might as well be people who understand what happens when good men choose to do nothing." Elena smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Luke had seen on her face since they'd met at his campfire 6 months earlier. "Then I guess we're partners for the long term." "Professional partners?" "That depends on whether you're planning to keep drifting from town to town like a tumbleweed, or if you're ready to put down roots somewhere." Luke looked out across the desert toward the mountains, where Jake's investigation had reached its climax. Then back at Elena's face, illuminated by the setting sun. For the first time in his adult life, the idea of staying in one place held more appeal than the freedom of the open trail. "I reckon Arizona's as good a place as any to build something lasting," he said. Sentinel raised his head from grazing and whinnied softly, as if approving of Luke's decision. The Mustang had found a new purpose after losing Jake, just as Luke had found direction after years of aimless drifting. Together, they'd continue the work that honest lawmen had always done, standing between good people and those who would exploit their trust. As darkness settled over the desert, Luke pinned Jake's badge more securely to his vest and gathered the reins. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in building honest government for Arizona territory, but tonight he was content to ride home with Elena beside him and Sentinel, carrying them both toward whatever future awaited. Behind them, the stone monument marked the spot where Marshal Jacob Whitmore's investigation had begun, with one man's determination to expose the truth. Ahead lay the work of ensuring that such sacrifice would never again be necessary in a land where justice finally had room to grow. The desert held many secrets, but Luke had learned that the most important ones were worth fighting for and worth building a life around. Jake's investigation was complete, but the responsibility it represented would continue as long as honest people were willing to stand up for what was right. In the distance, lights from Prescott twinkled like stars against the desert night, marking the location of territorial government that now served its citizens rather than exploiting them. Luke touched Jake's badge one final time, feeling its weight as promise rather than burden. Marshal Jacob Whitmore's work was done. Marshal Luke Mercer's was just beginning.